If you ever needed to integrate LLMs into your workflows, you've likely heard of LangChains and LangGraphs. Both are solid, well-known frameworks for constructing complex workflows around AI. However, their similar names often cause confusion. It's usually not clear how they relate to each other or which one is the right choice for your project. I'm Mindfulness from Oxylabs, and in this video I'll explain the differences between LangChains and LangGraphs, plus when to use each. Let's start by explaining LangChain. In essence, LangChain is a framework for creating structured linear applications made of sequences of steps. These steps are built using LangChain components, which can be thought of as building blocks that connect an LLM to data and tools for real-world tasks. These building blocks could be prompt templates that frame your instructions, the LLM itself, or an output parser that delivers the final result. Now, to build a workflow using these building blocks, you need to link them together in a sequence, or in this case, a chain. To understand it better, let's look at a simple example of building a scraped data structure using LangChain. Say you have an HTML code for a website that you scraped. You'd like to extract the data for the website into some readable format for further analysis. Using LangChain, we can form a workflow that consists of these main building blocks. We start with the input component that receives the raw HTML from the scraped website. Then, we add a prompt template that contains the core instructions for the LLM for parsing the HTML. It could look something like this. We can't forget the LLM step, which acts as the engine of the workflow. It takes the previously constructed prompt as input and produces an output. And finally, the output parser, which takes the raw LLM response and transforms it into a readable format, such as a JSON object. Since parsing data from a HTML file is simple enough to fit into a few steps, LangChain is the perfect solution for this. However, if the workflow gets more complex and requires conditional steps or even looping, LangChain is simply too limited. This is where LangGraph comes in. With LangGraph, instead of a linear chain, you define your building blocks as a graph, hence the name, where a group of steps can be executed with conditions or even cyclical loops. Here, each step in a graph is called a node, which is connected by edges, and nodes can have multiple edges to form entire node webs. We can visualize each node as a primary building block of the workflow, while the edge represents the components that determine where to direct the workflow next. LangGraph also introduces the concept of state, which in the history of the entire workflow, both referenced and updated at each node, serving as kind of a workflow memory. By combining these concepts, we can build much more complex flows that can handle dynamic environments or data. Let's go back to our example with the HTML parser. What if I want to expand our application to support two variants of a website? Since LangChain doesn't support conditional statements, we need to use them directly in the Python code, defeating the purpose of using linear logic for efficiency. However, we could convert this into a graph with separate nodes for each page in LangGraph, which is specifically designed to solve problems like this. Instead of a single chain, we could have a structure of nodes and edges like this. First, a classifier node. This block decides what type of page it is. Once we have the page classified, the following edge will decide where our workflow will head next, depending on the state it received. Then, we use two HTML parser nodes, one per website, and finally, we finish with an output parser node to produce a clean result, which is required no matter which path we took. These examples show the contrast between the two frameworks, and these differences get more pronounced once a project grows. However, the most important question is, how do you choose the right one for you? Let's walk through the natural journey of working on an AI-powered workflow. In most projects, you likely start with a simple goal in mind. Let's say you want to build a simple RAG system that answers questions based on a PDF document. This is a perfect job for LangChain because the workflow is a straight line. Retrieve information, pass it to the LLM with a prompt, and get the answer back. LangChain is the best choice here. Using anything more complex would be just inefficient. What happens if your application logic becomes more complex? Imagine a scenario where your RAG system needs to answer questions it doesn't have answers to in its current knowledge base. If you want it to answer something meaningful, you'll likely want it to take another step, like searching the web. This can be the first sign that your logic is getting complex, will require some type of forking, and is now getting messier. You'll find yourself writing if-else statements outside the chain in your Python code, which eventually feels more and more like a workaround instead of an additional feature. If you're in this spot, it's likely a signal that your workflow is starting to look more like a flowchart instead of a straight line, which is a clear indication LangGraph might be the logical next step. That being said, there are a couple of misconceptions that should be addressed. First, LangGraph isn't just a better version of LangChain, and it's a separate workflow designed to handle different level of complexity. The key is how each handles the workflow. With LangChain, it operates inside your code, while with LangGraph, you define it early on by showing how steps connect and branch. This is also why the idea that LangGraph is only for visualizing LangChain is inaccurate. Rather than being an evolution of one another, LangChain and LangGraph are parallel tools. The former brings efficiency and fast iteration, while the latter offers clear structure and more control. So to summarize the relationship between these two options, let's lay everything on the table. LangChain is a chain framework perfect for building a linear, LLM-based workflow that has a clear sequential path with limited state management. Also, it's much easier to implement or grasp for beginners. On the other hand, LangGraph is a graph-based workflow powerful enough for multi-agent pipelines and complex AI systems, where conditional paths, loops, and state management are harder to handle but open up a world of possibilities for complex projects. As a pro tip, you should only consider moving to LangGraph when your application logic truly demands it, like a conditional path or a persistent state. If you're a beginner or you're simply working on a smaller scope AI workflow, you should likely consider LangChain for its speed and simplicity. And if your project evolves or you're already working on a complex system, consider LangGraph for handling more advanced flows. In this video, we've covered the differences and similarities between LangChain and LangGraph and which tool might be best for your case. Want to learn more about data-powered AI workflows? Then check out Oxylabs blog linked down below. Or if you have any questions on how data can improve your AI workflows, email support@oxylabs.io or write to us via live chat on our homepage. Also, consider joining our Discord community where we discuss all things web scraping. Thank you for watching and see you next time.